You thought history was boring? Well, ancient historians didn't think so. Fun history. Fun, weird, and without silly dates. Hey guys, tonight we're talking about bread. Not the pathetic squishy stuff you buy today that deflates if you look at it wrong. No, we're talking about the medieval kind. The bread so dense, so nutritious, and so brutally honest, it could double as both a hearty meal and a legal bludgeoning device. So, dim the lights, maybe point a fan at your face for that authentic ASMR hum, and let's slip into a journey back to a time when bread wasn't just food, it was a lifestyle. To understand why medieval bread was basically the Avengers of nutrition, you have to grasp one simple, uncomfortable truth about the people who ate it. They didn't just eat bread. They entered into long-term, committed, contractual relationships with it. Bread wasn't a side dish, it was their identity. If you could travel back in time and ask a medieval peasant, "What's your favorite meal?" they'd beam and say, "Bread." If you then asked, "Okay, what's your least favorite meal?" they'd stare at you like you were an idiot and say, "Bread," but like older. This stuff made up a staggering 70% of a peasant's daily calories. Today, that level of carb dependency would be considered a cry for help and get you sent to a wellness retreat in Arizona. Back then, it was just called Tuesday. Breakfast was a hunk of bread. Lunch was a slightly larger hunk of yesterday's bread. Dinner was bread dipped in something vaguely warm, maybe broth, maybe water that had just given up on life. And for dessert, a smaller, slightly harder piece of bread that you pretended was a special treat because you sprinkled a bit of salt on it. But here's the plot twist that would shatter your modern, gluten-free, paleo-obsessed brain. This wasn't sad, desperate poverty food. Medieval bread was actually legitimately good. It was dense, sure. It was filling. It was packed with so many nutrients it could power a farmer through a 14-hour day of plowing fields, tending ornery livestock, repairing a leaky thatch roof, walking 10 miles uphill in the snow, and then defending the village from a known sheep thief named Ulrich. Modern bread can barely power you through the mental anguish of checking your work emails before you've had your second coffee. Bread was the great equalizer. Peasants gnawed on it, nobles nibbled on it, monks prayed over it, while secretly daydreaming about the ale they'd be brewing with it later. Even soldiers carried hardtack, a form of bread so durable and inedible it could survive a war, a flood, a siege, and quite possibly a small meteor strike. It was the original survival biscuit, except it tasted like gravel and had the structural integrity of a ceramic tile. Of course, not all bread was created equal, because the Middle Ages were a hotbed of classism, even in the bakery. Nobles got to enjoy soft, fluffy white loaves made from finely sifted flour, basically the medieval equivalent of a croissant, perfect for sopping up the juices of their third roasted swan. Peasants, on the other hand, were stuck with bread so dense it seemed to violate several known laws of physics. It was the kind of loaf you could use to fix a wobbly table leg. But regardless of texture, whether it was angelic cloud or compressed misery, bread was the universal language. It was everywhere. And here's the wildest part. Medieval people accidentally created a superfood. They didn't have nutritionists. They didn't have dietitians. They definitely didn't have wellness influencers screaming at them about gut health from a ring light. Their priorities were refreshingly simple. Will this keep me from starving to death before spring? Will this last through the winter without turning into a science experiment? Can I eat this without my entire family questioning my life choices? Bread answered yes to all three. It was easy to store, easy to transport, nearly impossible to screw up, and, a rare achievement in medieval cuisine, almost impossible to accidentally poison yourself with. Compared to the alternative medieval menu, which often featured spoiled meat, vegetables that only grew for 3 weeks, and water that could straight up murder you, bread was the dependable, rock-solid friend everyone clung to. It wasn't just food, it was survival, strategy, and the very foundation of medieval life, all baked into a single mighty loaf. To really understand why medieval bread was a nutritional cheat code, you have to look at the starting point, the flour. Because medieval flour wasn't the sad, pale, bleached powder you find in a modern grocery store. The stuff that's been so overprocessed it probably files your taxes for you. No, medieval flour was stone ground, rugged, unfiltered, and nutritionally aggressive. It didn't just sit there in your bread being a passive carbohydrate, it participated. Stone grinding was a brutal, no-nonsense process. It meant that everything in that grain was pulverized together. The bran, the germ, the endosperm, the essential minerals, and anything else the millstone felt like adding to the party, including, occasionally, tiny character-building flecks of the millstone itself. The result was a flour so packed with vitamins, fiber, and natural oils that modern dietitians would weep tears of unadulterated joy, while modern influencers would immediately try to rebrand it as an overpriced, artisanal, ancient grain detox cleanse. Compared to this rugged pioneer, modern flour is just sad. It's stripped, bleached, enriched, which is just a fancy way of saying they nuked all the good stuff out and then nervously added a few synthetic vitamins back in, and then treated like it needs to enter the witness protection program. It's like burning down your own house and then bragging that you installed a really nice new doorknob. Medieval flour, on the other hand, was whole in every sense of the word. Those ancient stone mills didn't discriminate. They ground everything, whether it liked it or not. This meant medieval bread was loaded with fiber for digestion, iron for strength, magnesium for muscle function, zinc for immunity, and healthy fats for sustained energy. And yes, it also contained trace amounts of rock dust for character. Technically, medieval people ate a little bit of stone every day, but that just meant their bread came with a bonus mineral supplement and a mildly crunchy surprise. That's what you call value. And because it was whole grain, this bread didn't just fill you up. It didn't give you that fake, temporary fullness that vanishes the second you see a donut. No, this was a deep, existential fullness. The kind of full that lasts until the sun goes down and your neighbor shows up to borrow your only ox. Peasants could work those insane, back-breaking days because their breakfast was a slow-burning log of energy, not the sugar-fueled emotional roller coaster that modern white bread sends you on. Stone-ground flour also had flavor, a deep, earthy, nutty, ancient flavor. The kind of flavor that whispers, "I was here before your entire country was even a twinkle in a mapmaker's eye." Modern flour, by comparison, tastes like disappointment and regret, with a faint hint of cardboard. If you've ever eaten modern bread and felt like it immediately filed a noise complaint inside your intestines, don't worry, the problem isn't you. It's the wheat. Modern wheat has been bred, crossbred, hybridized, genetically encouraged, and aggressively coached like a prima donna athlete preparing for the Olympics. It's been engineered for one purpose: to grow fast, grow big, and scream, "Look how disgustingly fluffy I can be." Meanwhile, your gut is just sitting there, bewildered, asking, "Who is this stranger, and why is he staging a hostile takeover of my digestive tract?" Medieval people didn't deal with this nonsense. Their wheat wasn't some Frankengrain created in a lab. It was ancient, calm, and respectful. Grains like einkorn, emmer, and spelt were the medieval MVPs. They were so old and wholesome, they probably addressed you as "my child." These ancient grains had lower gluten, more nutrients, and far fewer unpleasant surprises. They didn't puff up dramatically or behave unpredictably. They were steady and reliable. The medieval equivalent of that one friend who always shows up on time, never brings drama, and helps you move a couch. Eating them didn't trigger the bloat, the brain fog, or the low-grade existential dread that a single slice of modern sandwich bread can instill. Ancient grains also grew in soils that didn't know the meaning of mercy. Poor, rocky, unforgiving earth shaped grain that had actual backbone. Modern wheat collapses emotionally if it doesn't get perfect irrigation and ideal weather. Medieval wheat grew anywhere, like a stubborn weed with a surprisingly strong work ethic. And when baked into bread, these ancient grains produced loaves with real personality. Heavy, hearty, nutritious, and proudly dense enough to double as a home security device if thrown with enough force. These weren't soft, cloud-like slices of processed air. They were edible bricks of strength that told your body, "You're welcome." Medieval people thrived on this stuff. Modern bread leaves you tired. Medieval bread left you ready to wrestle a goat, plow a field, and then file a formal complaint about the king's new tax on goat wrestling. If you've ever proudly announced to your friends, "I bake sourdough now," congratulations! You have successfully recreated a process that medieval peasants did out of pure, unadulterated necessity, with zero Instagram posts, zero emotional support from a Pinterest mood board, and absolutely no one clapping for them. Medieval bakers didn't choose sourdough because it was rustic or artisanal. They chose it because that was the only option. Instant yeast didn't exist. Packets of active dry yeast weren't lining the medieval market stalls like little magical bags of bread optimism. Instead, medieval people relied entirely on wild fermentation, a polite term for nature is in charge now and we just have to hope it's feeling cooperative today. Inside every medieval starter lived a microscopic party of wild yeasts and lactic acid bacteria. They were the original probiotics, long before some supplement company convinced you to swallow a yogurt-flavored capsule first thing in the morning. These microbes would feast on the flour and water, multiply like gossip in a small village, and transform the dough into something alive, bubbling, and ready to bake. This slow, natural fermentation was a biochemical miracle disguised as a kitchen chore. As the dough sat for hours, sometimes overnight, the microbes got to work. They broke down the gluten, reduced bitterness, neutralized phytic acid, an anti-nutrient that blocks mineral absorption, and basically did all the digestive heavy lifting before the bread even entered your mouth. All you had to do was chew it without breaking a tooth. Compare that to modern bread, which often rises in a rushed 45 minutes, pumped full of turbocharged commercial yeast strains that work faster than a medieval tax collector. There's no relaxation, no microbial spa treatment, no friendly bacteria helping you out. Just speed, convenience, and the inevitable digestive consequences of doing everything way too quickly. It's fast food with a degree in psychology, tricking you into thinking it's real food. Medieval sourdough wasn't just easier on the stomach, it was actively good for it. The bacteria created lactic acid, which gave the bread that slight tang and, more importantly, helped preserve it naturally. That means medieval loaves didn't turn into a fuzzy science experiment in a day, unlike modern supermarket bread, which goes stale faster than a politician's promise. Even better, this fermentation created a rich, complex flavor, earthy, tangy, and deeply satisfying. It was the bread equivalent of a wise old monk who tells great stories and occasionally steals a little wine. If you've ever eaten modern bread and wondered, why does my stomach feel like it's reenacting a medieval siege? The answer is simple. Modern dough barely has time to wake up before it's thrown into the oven. Today's industrial bread rises in under an hour, sometimes under 20 minutes. That's not fermentation, that's bread speedrunning. It's the culinary equivalent of cramming for an exam and hoping the professor doesn't ask any real questions. Medieval dough, however, had time. Long, luxurious, spa retreat levels of time. 8, 12, sometimes 20 hours of slow fermenting, bubbling, resting, and contemplating the meaning of life. This was dough that had been spiritually awakened. By the time that medieval loaf reached your digestive system, it was practically waving a little flag that said, "Relax, friend, I've already handled it." Modern bread looks at your intestines and says, "Good luck, champ," and then sprints away. Medieval peasants weren't clutching their stomachs after a meal, Googling gluten intolerance symptoms on their stone tablets, or debating sourdough versus gluten-free diets in their candlelit cottages. They ate their bread and then they went back to work. The long fermentation also naturally preserved the bread. It stayed fresh for days, weeks if dried out. It didn't need preservatives, additives, or a list of ingredients that sound like a prescription for a rare tropical disease. Medieval bread was a chemically balanced, gut-friendly marvel, made entirely by accident and perfected through the simple, non-negotiable virtue of patience. If medieval bread was a slow, thoughtful, handwritten letter, modern bread is a text message typed in a hurry with autocorrect on, full of embarrassing typos and deeply questionable life choices. The biggest difference between medieval bread and modern bread comes down to one uncomfortable truth you can no longer ignore. Modern bread is basically fast food wearing a healthy Halloween costume. Let's start with fermentation time, or rather, the complete and utter lack of it. Modern industrial bread doesn't ferment, it rushes. Factories use commercial yeast that inflates dough in record time, the way a politician inflates promises during election season. While medieval dough sat around all day, relaxing like a monk in silent meditation, modern dough gets maybe 15 minutes before someone screams, "Bake it!" This creates bread that's fluffy, yes, but it's a fluff built on shortcuts and lies. It's like a mattress made entirely of marshmallows. It feels impressive for about 5 seconds until you realize your spine absolutely hates you. Then there are the additives. Medieval bakers used 3 ingredients: flour, water, and salt. That's it. End of list. No footnotes. Modern bread companies look at that simple, honest list and just say, "Cute." And then they add 27 more, just for fun. Emulsifiers, conditioners, bleaches, sweeteners, stabilizers, all working together like a corporate board meeting inside your loaf. Today's bread isn't baked, it's manufactured. It has the vibe of a food item that technically, legally qualifies as bread, but spiritually identifies as packing foam. If you flip over a modern loaf and read the ingredient label, you will find a paragraph, not a list. A paragraph of mysterious substances that would make a medieval monk clutch his rosary in sheer horror. You get things like calcium propionate, ascorbic acid, monoglycerides, and datum. You also get azodicarbonamide, which, by the way, is also used to make yoga mats. Yes, there is a non-zero chance that your sandwich bread and your gym floor share a key chemical component. Medieval peasants may have been cold, muddy, and smelling faintly of livestock, but at least their bread wasn't made from exercise equipment. Consider shelf life. Medieval bread went stale in a few days because it was real food. Modern bread can sit on your counter for a week, a month, or possibly until the heat death of the universe without changing shape. That's not bread. That's a science experiment that escaped the lab and made it to mass production. If a medieval peasant saw your perfectly soft, youthful-looking sliced bread sitting on your kitchen counter after 2 weeks, they'd assume you were a witch dabbling in dark sorcery. There's something deeply suspicious about a loaf that refuses to age. And don't even get me started on the hidden sugar. Modern bread is weirdly, unpleasantly sweet, like it's trying to trick your body into thinking it's having dessert. Medieval bakers would take one bite and say, "Why does this taste like someone panicked halfway through the recipe and just started adding sugar?" When you add it all up, the speed, the additives, the engineered sweetness, the artificial softness, you end up with something that resembles bread but behaves more like an edible imposter. Modern bread fills your stomach. Medieval bread fueled your existence. Your modern loaf isn't trying to actively poison you. It's just built for corporate convenience and shelf life, not for your actual human biology. It's designed to survive shipping, storage, and marketing, and it is morally unrepentant about being unnaturally soft for way too long. Medieval bread was honest about what it was. It lived and died within the rhythm of the village, and your body understood that. It recognized the microbes, the minerals, the grain. Medieval bread didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to be real. If you've ever eaten a slice of modern white bread and felt like your bloodstream immediately transformed into a sugary, chaotic theme park ride, Congratulations! You have experienced the glycemic roller coaster. Modern bread hits your blood sugar so fast and so hard that your pancreas has to stop what it's doing and file a formal complaint with your central nervous system. The energy spike is dramatic, chaotic, and incredibly short-lived, followed by a crash so severe you start questioning every life choice that led you to that moment. Medieval bread didn't do this. Medieval bread was slow, steady, sensible. It was the bread version of a responsible adult who wears practical shoes and has a 401k. Thanks to the whole grains, the fiber, the long fermentation, and the minimal processing, medieval bread digested gradually. Energy was released over time, in a calm, measured way. It wasn't dumped into your system like a bucket of glucose confetti. Picture a medieval peasant eating his bread in the morning. He didn't get a sugar rush. He didn't get a mid-morning crash. He didn't get hangry at 11 a.m. and threaten violence over a missing snack. He got stable, sustained energy that powered him through his day of physical labor, the kind of work that would send your average modern office worker directly to the HR department complaining of hostile work environment and unreasonable physical demands. This wasn't magic. It was simply chemistry that hadn't been messed with by food scientists yet. The bran and germ in that coarse, medieval flour acted like natural speed bumps, slowing down digestion and flattening the glucose curve. The fiber forced the body to take its time. The fermentation had already broken down complex sugars before the bread even touched the peasant's tongue. The result was a loaf that treated your bloodstream like a calm, polite houseguest, not a drunken frat boy. Modern bread, on the other hand, comes at your body like a medieval battering ram. The refined flour contains almost no fiber, meaning the glucose hits your bloodstream with all the subtlety of a cat, methodically knocking every single thing off a shelf at 3 a.m. Breakfast becomes a sprint, followed by a slump, followed by a desperate need for caffeine, followed by a deep sense of regret about your life choices. Medieval peasants didn't know what a glycemic index was. They didn't have charts, nutritionists, or influencers shouting at them through glowing rectangles. They just knew, through centuries of trial and error, that after eating their bread, they could work, they could function, they could survive without collapsing dramatically on the barn floor. The difference is stark and undeniable. Medieval bread supported your metabolism. Modern bread tries to hijack it. And the consequences are written all over our collective health. Today, millions of people struggle with blood sugar spikes, energy crashes, insulin resistance, and cravings that are directly created by foods designed for profit, not for human physiology. Medieval bread nourished. Modern bread negotiates with your bloodstream like a shady merchant selling questionable potions from the back of a cart. Here's the funniest part of all. Medieval people had absolutely no idea why their bread worked so well. They didn't know what gut bacteria were. They didn't know about microbiomes, digestive enzymes, or probiotics. They didn't even wash their hands consistently. And yet, somehow, their bread was a daily gift to their digestive system. It was a total, complete, glorious accident. Zero research, no health gurus, just hungry people and hungry microbes doing their thing together in perfect, blissful ignorance. Their bread carried beneficial acids produced during fermentation that encouraged good digestion and supported healthy gut flora. It was loaded with fiber that fed the good bacteria. It was a complete, whole food meal disguised as a humble loaf. Your ancestors didn't need to understand the science. They just reaped the benefits, one delicious, gut-friendly bite at a time. If you've ever wondered how medieval people managed to accomplish anything, hauling stones to build cathedrals, swinging axes for hours, carrying livestock, climbing battlements, digging trenches, fighting wars, and walking everywhere without collapsing like dehydrated houseplants, the answer is surprisingly simple. Bread. Not the modern stuff that would have knocked them out cold by lunchtime, but their bread. The nutritional equivalent of powering your body with a slow-burning, nuclear-powered furnace instead of a single, sputtering birthday candle. Medieval peasants weren't nibbling on delicate croissants. They were consuming dense, whole-grain loaves that weighed roughly as much as a modern dumbbell. One slice could keep you full for hours. 2 slices could power you through an entire day of brutal manual labor. 3 slices, and you were basically invincible, unless the local lord decided to raise the taxes on your invincibility again. This bread was engineered by nature and accident, not by factories and focus groups. It delivered complex carbohydrates that released energy slowly and consistently. Combined with all those minerals, healthy fats, and that fermentation-enhanced nutrition, medieval bread was a complete meal disguised as a simple staple. This meant their bodies were conditioned on a steady flow of real energy. They didn't deal with the dreaded 2 p.m. afternoon crash, where you find yourself staring blankly at a computer screen begging for sweet release. They weren't snacking every hour. They weren't craving pastries or sugary coffee drinks sprinkled with cinnamon and existential regret. Their diet kept them moving because it was designed, entirely by accident, for endurance. And bread wasn't a lonely hero. It had a supporting cast. Medieval people weren't pairing their bread with ultra-processed deli meat or flavored spreads with ingredient lists that read like alchemical spells. They ate it with simple foods that made sense. Take cheese, for instance. Medieval cheese wasn't that fluorescent, rubbery block you find in the discount bin. It was real cheese, aged, tangy, dense, and powerful enough to knock you backwards if you weren't prepared. Paired with that whole-grain, fermented bread, it created a nutrient combo strong enough to let a peasant walk 15 miles before breakfast without complaining. Modern people whine when the Wi-Fi goes out for 10 minutes. Then there was broth, whatever savory liquid you got from boiling bones and vegetables. Bread dipped into that broth, softened into a nutritious, warm, porridge-like meal. It was the medieval version of comfort food, minus the existential guilt. Beans were another partner, rich in protein and fiber, making the bread even more effective as a daily staple. Together, they formed a nutritional duo so successful that entire populations survived on them. Imagine telling a medieval peasant that modern humans voluntarily avoid carbs and legumes. They would assume you'd been cursed by a witch. One of the biggest reasons this bread was so good is that making it was an absolute ordeal. There were no bread machines, no stand mixers. Bread was a process, a lifestyle, a commitment rivaled only by marriage and the annual plague season. You had to mill the grain at a lord-owned mill. You had to knead by hand for an hour, which was essentially arm day at the gym, except your only reward was not starving. You had to tend a finicky sourdough starter that demanded constant attention. You had to wait through a long fermentation. And finally, you had to bake it in an oven you heated with actual firewood. All this effort meant no one cut corners. Every single step, from milling to kneading to baking, created bread that was dense, flavorful, and naturally probiotic. Medieval bread was exceptional because it had to be. When your very survival depends on a loaf of bread, you tend to make it properly. In the end, the difference comes down to one brutal truth. Medieval bread knew exactly what it was. Simple, honest fuel for a hard life. It was the nutritional equivalent of a blunt, hard-working farmer who rises before dawn, lifts boulders for fun, and speaks in complete, emotionally stable sentences. Modern bread, meanwhile, is like a confused, overeager intern who keeps adding unnecessary ingredients to a project, desperately trying to prove it belongs in the meeting. Medieval bread was a partner in survival. Modern bread behaves more like a well-meaning but deeply incompetent roommate who eats your food, breaks your stuff, and then blames you for it. Your ancestors didn't avoid gluten. Gluten avoided them. They built a civilization on a loaf of bread that was real, honest, and true. And we, in our infinite wisdom, traded it all in for a slice of squishy, sweet, chemically complex disappointment that tastes faintly of yoga mats and regret.